You know that feeling when you're completely lost in a movie or a video? It just transports you, right?
Absolutely.
It makes you feel things, helps you understand incredibly complex stories or ideas just by the power of what you see.
Hmm.
There's an undeniable magic to visual storytelling, but how is that magic actually made? What is the invisible language, the underlying grammar that shapes what we experience on screen?
It's tempting to think it's just, pointing a camera and hitting record, but that's like saying writing a novel is just typing words.
Right,
There's a deep craft involved.
right.
A set of foundational techniques that separate simply documenting something from truly telling a story with images in a compelling way.
Exactly. And that hidden language, that grammar, is precisely what we're diving into today. We have in front of us excerpts from a real classic, a text that many consider foundational, The 5 C's of Cinematography by Joseph B. Mascelli.
A seminal work, yeah.
This edition even features an introduction by the legendary cinematographer Arthur C. Miller. Our source tells us that Mascelli undertook the significant task of trying to translate the many intangibles of filmmaking into definitive explanations.
And that translation was incredibly necessary. As Arthur C. Miller highlights in his introduction, for a long time, learning the craft of cinematography was primarily an apprenticeship model. Or, you just watched films obsessively and tried to puzzle out how they achieved certain effects.
Right, trying to reverse engineer it.
Exactly. So having a clear written text that breaks down the principles is, as Miller puts it, immensely valuable for aspiring and practicing filmmakers alike.
Absolutely. Miller's introduction is fascinating because he notes how production methods have evolved. We have faster editing. Audiences are used to a quicker pace.
Totally different landscape now in some ways.
Yeah, the moving camera and widescreen formats can mean fewer traditional cuts. And there's been a shift towards more naturalistic lighting and camera work in many genres. But his core point, and it's central to this deep dive, is that despite all these changes, the fundamental storytelling aspects, the visual grammar Mascelli identifies, remains constant.
Precisely. The core principles endure because they tap into how we visually process information and emotion. Technology changes, but human perception and narrative needs remain surprisingly stable.
So our mission today is to unpack those core principles, the fundamental building blocks Mascelli lays out as the 5 C's: camera angles, continuity, cutting, close-ups, and composition.
The big 5.
We want to explore how these elements, when used thoughtfully, work together not just to show things, but to create compelling, clear, and emotionally impactful visual narratives.
Right.
By understanding them, you start to see the difference between, amateur footage and truly cinematic mastery. And we'll pull examples directly from the source material to illustrate these points.
It's worth setting the stage with one more intriguing note from the author before we jump into the C's. Mascelli hints at a potential 6th C: cheating.
Cheating sounds bad.
Well, it isn't about any kind of dishonesty in the usual sense. Rather, it's described as an art form, perfected through experience. It's the skillful technique of subtly rearranging people, objects, or actions during filming or editing to enhance the effect on screen, doing it so seamlessly that the audience never even suspects a change has occurred.
Like shifting a prop slightly between takes, maybe?
Huh.
Or using perspective tricks to make something look bigger or smaller?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or adjusting a player's position just slightly from where they were in reality to make the composition better in the final cut.
Right.
The source mentions the only crime in cheating is getting caught. It's that invisible craft that maintains the illusion. It speaks volumes about the artificial yet ultimately powerful nature of filmmaking. It's all about creating a convincing illusion that serves the story.
Okay, let's unpack this fundamental grammar of film, starting with the very first C, the literal perspective from which we see everything.
That's camera angles. This is the most basic decision you make for every single shot. Simply, where is the camera positioned relative to your subject?
Seems simple enough.
But that one decision is incredibly powerful because it determines 2 critical things simultaneously: the audience's exact viewpoint and the specific area of the scene that's included in the frame.
Right. So it's not just what information you're giving the viewer, but how you're making them perceive it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a thoughtfully chosen angle doesn't just show the action, it enhances it, helping to dramatically visualize the narrative or clarify complex movement.
Okay.
On the flip side, a poorly chosen angle can be incredibly distracting, confusing, or even make the audience misinterpret what's happening. While truly experienced filmmakers might make these choices instinctively, The source stresses that for those learning or even just being more deliberate, it starts with a careful analysis of what the story requires at that precise moment.
What stands out to you about how Mascelli breaks down the different types of audience viewpoints, objective versus subjective or POV?
What's fascinating here is how the camera can either keep the audience at a distance as a purely detached observer.
Like just watching from the sidelines.
Right, the objective viewpoint. You're an impersonal bystander.
Yeah.
You're watching the action unfold from a kind of detached perspective, like a general observer.
Yeah.
You see characters' actions, settings, but it's not tied to any specific character's experience.
Just seeing it happen.
Precisely. Subjective, however, is where the camera literally becomes the eyes of a character in the picture.
Ah, okay.
The audience doesn't just see the event, they experience it as if it were happening to them. This is a really powerful technique to draw the audience in emotionally and physically.
Like the source mentions, being on that thrilling roller coaster ride in Cinerama,
Yes.
you feel the dips and turns because the camera's positioned exactly where your eyes would be.
That's the classic example. The immersive widescreen and sound enhance it, sure, but the core of that subjective power is experiencing the physical sensation because the camera is you.
Right.
The source lists other vivid examples. Filming from a speeding bobsled, an airplane cockpit looking out, an aerial tramway climbing a mountain, a funicular railroad, or especially precarious views from a twisting mountain road. You feel the speed, the height, the danger.
But it doesn't have to be that dramatic, right? The source mentions a camera tour of an art museum or moving along an assembly line could also be subjective.
Yes, the involvement is often greatest when there's potential for shock or physical sensation. But simply seeing a space or an object through a character's literal viewpoint makes it subjective.
Okay.
For instance, a shot looking out an airplane window is purely objective unless it's immediately preceded by a close-up of a character looking intensely off-screen in that direction.
Ah, then you know whose view it is.
Exactly. Then the audience understands, this is what they're seeing, and it becomes subjective.
And point of view, or POV, is closely related but can be static.
That's right. A static shot of something like a clock on the wall, an empty room, or people in a park would normally be interpreted as objective. But again, if you place a close-up of a character looking off-screen right before that static shot, the audience instantly understands that they are seeing what that character sees.
So it becomes their POV.
That makes it a POD shot. Both subjective and POV viewpoints involve the audience more intimately than a purely objective one. They place the audience inside the story's world.
This next one is fascinating, the look into the lens technique. Why does the source call this out as a specific type of subjective shot?
Because it is the most direct form of subjective address. When whether an actor in a scripted film looking at the camera for a specific effect or an interviewee in a documentary looks directly into the lens.
They're looking right at you.
They are looking directly at you, the viewer. It creates an incredibly strong sense of personal connection, making you feel like you're being spoken to individually.
Yeah.
It can be very powerful, especially in nonfiction contexts like newsreels or explanatory films.
It's almost like they're breaking the fourth wall and acknowledging your presence.
Exactly. It establishes a direct relationship. However, the source points out a significant pitfall.
Uh-oh.
If the subject's gaze isn't consistent, if they keep glancing back and forth between the camera lens and an off-screen interviewer, it divides the audience's attention. It weakens that powerful, direct connection and can feel awkward.
Ah, yeah, I've seen that. It feels weird.
Right. So the best practice for this technique, if you want that direct address, is for the subject to look straight into the lens the entire time. That's the advice Mascelli gives for maximizing its impact.
Okay.
For other interview or dialogue situations where you don't want that direct address, the source suggests alternative staging, like using over-the-shoulder shots.
Right.
Or having the off-screen reporter positioned right next to the camera so the interviewee naturally looks towards the lens while responding to them.
Makes sense.
And definitely avoid the awkwardness of two subjects facing each other, but occasionally glancing towards the camera.
Okay, so camera angle isn't just about the viewpoint, the perspective you give the audience. It's also fundamentally about image size, the sheer scale of what they're seeing on screen.
Absolutely. Image size determines how large your subject appears, ranging from a tiny element in an extreme long shot to a magnified detail in an extreme close-up.
Right.
But it's not just about these fixed categories. It's about the spectrum of sizes.
Yeah.
And more importantly, how you use different sizes in sequence.
And that size can even change within a single shot, right?
Yes, dynamically.
Mm-hmm.
You can change image size during a shot by moving the camera itself, like a pan or a dolly in,
Okay.
or by having players move closer or further from the camera, or by using a zoom lens. So a shot could potentially start as a long shot and end as a close-up, all in one fluid movement.
The source talks about using different series of shots with varying image sizes. Progression, regression, contrasting, and repetitious. Can you break those down?
Sure, these are key patterns that influence the visual rhythm and emphasis. Progression is a series of shots where the image size increases, like going from a long shot to a medium shot to a close-up.
Getting closer.
You're getting closer and closer to the subject. Regression is the reverse, moving further away with each cut.
Backing off.
Contrasting involves pairing shots with very different image sizes, often for emphasis or dramatic opposition, like a wide shot of a crowd suddenly cutting to a tight close-up of one person's anxious face.
Yeah, that juxtaposition.
Exactly. And repetitious means using a series of shots that are all roughly the same image size, like a series of close-ups during a tense interrogation scene.
Okay.
The thoughtful use of these patterns is vital for guiding the audience's attention and building momentum.
So those general definitions, ELS, LS, MS, CU, ECU, are really just guidelines, and the terms themselves can be a bit fuzzy.
Exactly. What one person calls a medium shot, another might call a medium close-up. The labels aren't as important as the understanding of the spectrum and how the size choice affects the viewing experience.
Right.
Generally, an ELS, extreme long shot, introduces the scene on a grand scale or establishes a large area. An LS, long shot, shows the entire area, establishing place, people, objects.
Setting the scene.
An MS, medium shot, is often waist up or shows two characters interacting. The source highlights the two-shot MS as particularly dramatically interesting for dialogue, noting its origin in Hollywood as the American shot.
American show, huh?
Yeah. Then a CU, close-up, isolates and emphasizes the subject, showing detail or emotion. And an ECU, extreme close-up, magnifies the tiniest detail for extreme dramatic emphasis.
That American shot, MS2 shot, specifically for characters confronting each other for dialogue, is called out. What about variations like profile shots?
Profile two-shots are common, but the source notes they aren't always the most pictorially interesting. Dominance in a profile two-shot tends to come from dialogue, action, or lighting, rather than the composition itself, unless you use specific angling. Three-quarter angling, where you see both the front and side of a person's face, allows for much finer modeling of their features and makes it easier to establish dominance through camera position and lighting.
More dimension.
Right. The source even mentions creatively cheating positions, or using mirrors for unique staging and dominance effects in two shots.
And inserts are essentially a specific type of close-up?
Yes, they are cut-in close-ups that typically show text, map details, or small objects that are part of the main scene, like hands or fingers. They replace a portion of the main scene temporarily to show detail.
Crucial for detail.
Absolutely. And when using inserts of hands or objects within a scene, it's crucial that the position and action match the preceding wider shot for continuity.
Gotta match.
The source also gives a practical tip for widescreen. Frame your inserts a bit loosely so important text isn't cut off on the edges when projected.
Good tip. Moving on, the third key aspect of camera angles is height, tilting the camera up or down relative to the subject. How does changing the vertical position influence how we perceive things?
Oh, changing the camera's height dramatically alters the audience's perspective and can have a powerful psychological effect on how they view the subject.
Okay.
A level angle is the standard, often eye level. Filming the scene as a neutral bystander might see it. In these shots, the background behind the subject is often very important for context.
So a high angle is tilting the camera down.
Correct. The camera's positioned above and tilted downward. This is excellent for showing action unfolding over a large area or in depth, like a football game, a military formation, or a migration route.
Like an overview.
Exactly. It reduces depth of field relative to a level shot, which can help keep a wide area in focus. High angles are also great for establishing setting on a grand scale, like showing an entire industrial complex from above.
And how does it affect how we see characters?
A high angle can make subjects appear smaller, more vulnerable, or even degraded. The source gives the example of intensifying a suspect's beaten appearance by filming them from a high angle.
Makes them look weak.
Yeah. Seeing a ship enter a harbor from high above immediately establishes the geographical layout. High angles often feel detached, like an impersonal or God's eye view, unless deliberately used subjectively. perhaps showing a character looking down from a height.
And a low angle is tilting the camera up.
Exactly. The camera's positioned below and tilted upward. It doesn't necessarily have to be a literal worm's eye view right on the ground.
Okay.
Low angles are used to create feelings of awe, power, or excitement. They can make a subject appear taller or faster, help separate players or objects from cluttered foregrounds, drop the horizon out of frame, eliminate unwanted background elements, or intensify dramatic impact by distorting perspective.
Like making a character look powerful or imposing.
Precisely. Low angles cause subjects to loom up, and this effect is amplified by wide-angle lenses, though you have to be careful not to caricature players with excessive distortion.
Yeah.
A low-angle shot of an advancing soldier increases their perceived size and speed. The source specifically suggests using low angles for characters, or symbols of law or authority, often visually positioning an opposing player in a lower physical or compositional space to emphasize the authority figure's dominance.
The source warns about wide-angle lenses used with low angles causing caricature.
Yes, distortion of features can definitely be a risk. Mascelli notes that very high and very low angles produce drastic effects and are generally reserved for moments requiring intense drama, while more subtle angling is used routinely.
Okay, now for the one that always feels a bit off-kilter, the Dutch tilt.
Ah, the canted angle, yes. This is a deliberate choice to tilt the camera's vertical axis so it's no longer parallel with the subject's vertical axis.
Yeah.
The result is an image that is diagonally sloped and feels off-balance.
It always feels a bit unsettling or chaotic.
And that's exactly the purpose. The source explains it's reserved for sequences that need to feel weird, violent, unstable, impressionistic, or novel. It's perfect for showing a character who is literally or figuratively off balance, perhaps drunk, delirious, in a state of panic, or experiencing high emotional distress.
Makes sense.
It can also be used in montages, like showing a tilted building. You can even use pairs of opposing tilts for a dynamic effect.
The source even assigns directional meaning to the tilt itself.
It does, tapping into subtle visual psychology. An image that slants right, so from lower left to upper right, is interpreted as active and forceful, suggesting upward movement or ascent.
Going up.
Conversely, an image slanting left, from upper left to lower right, is seen as weak and static, suggesting downward movement or descent.
Going down.
Right. This principle can even apply to travel shots, where a subject should ideally appear to be climbing up the screen when moving towards the camera and descending when moving away, especially on angled terrain.
Interesting detail.
Like any strong effect, the source cautions using the Dutch tilt with discretion to avoid distracting from the core storytelling.
So, when you're actually filming, you're combining these decisions about image size and viewpoint shape tilt.
Absolutely. The area you photograph, the image size, and the angle you choose viewpoint, height, tilt, are interdependent. You're not just picking one or the other.
They work together.
A series of shots should use conscious patterns for both image size and angle progression, regression, contrasting, or repetitious combinations. You want to avoid a random hodgepodge of choices that feel disconnected.
Yeah.
Each angle change moves the audience, and that move should have a reason.
How do you make those transitions between sizes and angles feel smooth?
The source suggests integrating the changes. For instance, as the subject gets closer, instead of just cutting straight into a tighter shot, you can also move the camera around to a side angle simultaneously.
Okay.
This smoothly combines size progression with an angle change. Contrasting pairs of shots can use contrast in both size and angle, and repetitious series should either maintain similar sizes and angles or similar sizes with opposing angles, like the back and forth and over-the-shoulder shots.
And this is where we revisit the warning about jump cuts.
Crucially, a jump cut is a jarring, disorienting edit, where the subject appears to suddenly jerk or shift slightly between consecutive shots.
Right. Very noticeable.
That happens when the camera angle changes only slightly between two shots, while the image size remains approximately the same. The key to avoiding this is to ensure you change both the image size and the camera angle significantly between shots.
Both things have to change substantially.
Yes. By moving the viewpoint more distinctly, perhaps circling around the subject slightly rather than just moving straight in or out, you create a new, distinct angle that helps mask minor mismatches and prevents the jump.
It sounds like every angle decision needs to be rooted in the narrative, not just where you put the camera, but why for the story.
Precisely. The choice of angle is fundamentally determined by how you want the players or action to be depicted at that specific moment in the story.
Right.
A simple LS-MSCU sequence might seem logical, but it's not always the most dramatically effective approach. You have to constantly consider the impression the shot should make. Should it draw the audience in emotionally, subjective, or encourage them to evaluate the events impersonally, objective? The source gives the example of comparing prototype aircraft, suggesting an objective approach is likely best to allow for clear evaluation.
So it's really about constantly analyzing the scene through the potential viewer's eyes.
Exactly. What does the audience most need or want to see right now? If their interest is divided, you must concentrate the camera on the single most interesting element.
Focus.
The source uses a powerful analogy. A simple drop of solder being applied to a circuit board can be made as dramatically engaging as pioneers crossing rugged terrain if it's depicted with the correct angles and emphasis.
Wow.
It requires pre-analyzing the overall action to determine the necessary shots and angles beforehand and ensuring you film enough variety for the editor.
Beyond narrative intent, the source mentions practical and editorial factors influencing angle choices.
Absolutely. Real-world limitations often force compromises, especially for documentary or news cameramen who have less control.
Right.
Uncontrollable factors include things like whether overcast light is versatile, but you might have to angle carefully to avoid a bland, bald sky. Terrain can dictate what you can include or exclude.
Physical limitations, too.
Huge ones, especially in interiors, room size and shape, low ceilings, fixed props or machinery, poorly painted walls, and the extremely limited space inside vehicles, cockpits, control rooms, or even small trailers. Studio cinematographers have more flexibility with things like wild walls and movable props.
And editorial needs can constrain choices even before filming begins.
Yes. Detailed scripts might specify exact angles, but master scene scripts leave it to the director and cameraman. If you're shooting off the cuff, maybe for a documentary or corporate video, you must anticipate how the footage will be edited together.
Think ahead.
The individual key scenes can get unique treatments, but most shots need to relate cohesively to others in the sequence.
I found the advice on filming text, like signs or documents, really specific and interesting, the reading angles.
It's a subtle but significant detail based on established viewing habits that can make a big difference in audience comfort.
Wow, so?
For signs with characters diminishing in size from left to right, filming from that angle is best for readability. For multi-line printed material, the source says it should slope uphill from lower left to upper right on screen.
Uphill.
Yeah. This aligns with our natural reading habit of scanning left to right and dropping down to the next line. If the text slopes downwards, it forces the viewer's eye to move unnaturally upward to find the start of the next line, which the source says is distressing and causes eye strain.
Huh. Never thought about that.
It's those seemingly small details that contribute to the overall smooth experience. They might seem like splitting hairs, but they're based on deep-seated viewing psychology and contribute to the subconscious sense of ease or discomfort while watching.
So, to summarize camera angles, what's the core message?
The core message is that camera angles are absolutely fundamental to how the audience perceives and reacts to your film. Image size and angle together determine precisely what is seen and from what viewpoint.
Got it.
Every change in angle is a deliberate shift in the audience's perspective, and it must count towards telling the story or enhancing the drama. You should shoot with editing in mind, using deliberate patterns like progressive or contrasting angles, rather than just shooting haphazardly.
Be purposeful.
Thoughtful use of angles add vital visual variety and dramatic impact, which is essential for holding audience interest. It's about deliberate, purposeful choices for every single shot.
And that focus on purposeful choices and smooth flow leads us directly to the second C.
Continuity.
This is where everything connects and flows together, right?
It is. Continuity is the principle of presenting a continuous, smooth, and logical flow of both visual images and sound, so that the filmed event is depicted coherently and makes sense to the viewer. The source emphasizes this. The continuous aspect is what ultimately determines the success or failure of the production in holding the audience's attention and belief.
And this involves managing continuity in terms of time and space.
Yes. Time continuity deals with the temporal flow of events. Present time is the most straightforward events happening chronologically in a single location.
Simple enough.
Past time involves events that occurred previously, either an entire story set in the past or flashbacks woven into a present narrative. If it's a historical piece, the goal is often a "you were there" feeling, even while acknowledging the setting is historical.
And space continuity is about movement through physical locations.
Right. Depicting a story that involves constant movement through physical space, like a race, a journey, or a chase.
Right.
Most stories, in fact, use a combination of both time and space continuity. often switching between them. A film might start by using space continuity to transport the viewer to a foreign land, then settle into time continuity to tell the story within one specific locale. The critical thing is avoiding confusing the audience about where and when things are happening. Unless, as the source points out, the story is a suspense piece deliberately designed to create temporary confusion for dramatic effect.
Got it.
You can also shorten apparent space by showing only the highlights of a long journey.
The source distinguishes between filming action that is controlled versus uncontrolled.
Yeah.
How does that affect the approach to continuity?
It's a fundamental difference in the cameraman's role in control. Controlled action is what you find in theatrical films or carefully staged productions. The events are planned, rehearsed, staged.
You set it all up?
And the cameraman can direct and regulate everything. You can do multiple takes and angles until you get it perfect. You have complete control over aesthetic and technical elements.
Like filming a scene with actors on a soundstage?
Exactly. Uncontrolled action is filmed as it happens, with little to no ability to direct or repeat it. This is news stills, documentaries of natural disasters like hurricanes or fires.
Real life unfolding.
Or even planned events like parades or air shows, where you can't control the participants or the timing. The cameraman is an observer, adapting to prevailing conditions, often in a one-take situation. Their choices are limited by factors like available light, space, or even danger.
In those uncontrolled situations, the source mentions using multiple cameras.
Yes, multi-camera setups are common for uncontrolled action, like a flight test or an outdoor equipment demonstration that can't be easily repeated.
Multiple.
By positioning multiple camera on the same side of the action axis, a key rule we'll get to, simultaneously capturing long, medium, and close-up views, you ensure the editor has enough coverage from different angles to cut a coherent sequence later.
Covers your bases.
Exactly. This method is also used in productions like TV situation comedies or non-theatrical films where repeating action is difficult. The main advantage is getting sufficient editorial coverage with the least amount of time and effort on location.
Disadvantages.
The disadvantage is the added cost of film and processing from multiple cameras. But often, as the source notes, it's the only practical way to film the event.
The source also details the two main single-camera techniques for achieving continuity, the master scene technique and the triple take technique. What's the master scene approach?
The master scene technique is the standard method in theatrical film production. You first film the entire sequence or scene from a relatively wide shot, the master scene.
The whole thing first.
Then you repeat the entire action again multiple times to film closer shots, medium shots, close-ups, inserts covering parts of that scene.
What are the trade-offs there? That sounds tough on the actors.
The disadvantages are significant for the actors and production team. Players must memorize and perform entire long sequences repeatedly. They have to hit their marks precisely and replicate their performance.
Exactly the same way.
Including timing, movements, and use of props, exactly for each closer shot so that the action will match perfectly when edited together. Long or complex sequences require highly professional actors. Player and camera movements must be meticulously blocked. The closer shots have to be planned specifically to duplicate the positions, looks, and prop usage from the master shot. Only limited cheating is allowed during filming.
So why do it?
However, the source states that the immense advantages for the editor far outweigh these difficulties. Filming a master scene plus all the coverage shots provides maximum flexibility in the editing room to craft the final scene rhythm and emphasis.
Okay, flexibility for the edit. And the triple take, or cutting in the camera.
This is a simpler method, often used without a detailed script, where the cameraman essentially performs the editing while filming.
How does that work?
It involves overlapping the action at the beginning and end of each shot. The cameraman has to visualize the entire sequence shot by shot in advance, almost in a stream of consciousness flow. It requires extreme concentration, especially if they're working alone. You might use a second camera for additional angles or cut-ins for particularly tricky, time-consuming, or one-time events that you can't repeat, like intricate machine assembly or a rocket engine firing.
This concept of screen direction seems absolutely critical for continuity. It's about maintaining the viewer's spatial understanding.
It is one of the most important principles. The camera lens creates the reality for the film. What matters is how things look and move on screen, not necessarily how they happened in reality.
Okay.
Sometimes a subject might even need to travel in the wrong physical direction to appear correctly on screen.
So constant screen direction means maintaining the same direction of movement across a series of cuts.
Yes. A subject consistently travels across the screen in one direction, for example, always left to right. You establish this direction early in a sequence, and then subsequent shots of that subject moving should maintain it.
And contrasting screen direction.
This is used deliberately for dramatic effect. It's when you show two or more moving subjects traveling towards each other on screen.
Heading for a collision.
Exactly. This builds suspense, predicts a clash, or adds dramatic impact. The source gives classic examples. The hero versus the villain approaching, Indians versus cavalry, or football teams entering the field from opposite ends. The opposing movement visually reinforces their narrative opposition.
There's a point about applying map conventions. East is right, west is left. That's interesting.
Yes, the source notes that our minds are conditioned by maps. So eastbound movement, left to right on screen, feels natural and aligns with reading habits.
Okay.
Westbound movement, right to left, feels slightly stronger, more like moving against the grain.
Mm.
Northbound, descending from lower left to upper right, and southbound, descending from upper left to lower right, align with compositional ideas of up-down movement, although depicting these on a horizontal screen is less straightforward than horizontal travel.
What about subjects moving directly towards or away from the camera?
That's neutral screen direction. Movement head-on, towards the camera, or tail away from the camera. This movement is only truly non-directional if the subject is centered in the frame. If they enter or exit the frame from the side, it still implies a direction. Neutral shots are very useful because they can be intercut with movements in either constant direction.
Flexible.
You can even use a neutral shot deliberately to switch screen direction, for instance. A head-on shot that exits the frame on the left can transition smoothly into a subsequent shot where the subject moves left to right. Or a shot entering from the left can become neutral as it moves away from the camera.
And the source warns against a subject entering and exiting on the same side.
Generally, yes, it's confusing. You should avoid a subject entering and then exiting the same side of the frame in consecutive shots unless you deliberately show a curve in their path to transition smoothly between opposing constant directions.
Show the turn.
Showing the turn provides the visual logic for the change in direction.
Building on screen direction, the most fundamental rule for maintaining spatial continuity is the action axis, also called the line, or famously, the 180-degree rule.
Ah, the 180 rule. This is the one that film students always hear about.
It's critical. The action axis is an imaginary line drawn through the main action or between two characters interacting in a scene. The principle is that for a given sequence, all camera positions should remain on one side of this imaginary line.
And why is crossing that line so disorienting?
Because crossing the axis completely flips the screen direction of the subjects relative to each other. If you're filming two people talking and you jump your camera position to the other side of the line connecting them, in the next shot, the person who is on the left of the screen will suddenly appear on the right and vice versa. Even though they haven't moved, their spatial relationship on screen is reversed.
Ah, okay. That would be confusing.
This immediately disorients the audience and shatters the illusion of continuous space.
How is that axis established?
It's established implicitly by the first shot that shows the spatial relationship between the main subjects or between the subject and the camera. Once that relationship is shown, the line is effectively drawn.
Are there ever situations where you have to cross or cheat the axis?
Yes, the source acknowledges that practical considerations like sun angle, background elements, or terrain might necessitate crossing the axis for certain shots.
Okay.
You can also technically cross it optically using a longer lens from the same side, or physically move to the other side to film players in the rear of a set that aren't part of the main axis.
But there's a catch.
But if you physically move the camera to the other side of the axis, the key to cheating it successfully is that you must also reverse the subject's movement direction relative to the axis to maintain the same spatial relationship on screen.
Ah, so the relationship stays consistent.
The relationship between subject movement and camera setup has to remain consistent across the cut. It's all about protecting that spatial logic for the viewer's brain.
Absolutely. And tied very closely to this is matching looks, ensuring players are looking in the correct direction on screen.
Eyeline matching.
Exactly. The source uses the phrase, "the eyes govern the look," and it's spot on. Maintaining consistent eyeline matching is essential for players to appear to be relating to each other smoothly in back-and-forth shots.
Makes sense.
A player's gaze cannot suddenly change direction between shots. Any change must be shown within a shot. Matching players' positions and their looks is absolutely requisite for match-cutting consecutive shots to appear as continuous action.
The source says 3/4 angle generally determines the look, but flat-on POV can be tricky.
Yes. With a three-quarter angle, the direction of the look is pretty clear. With a flat-on POV, if the player's eyes shift even slightly from being centered in the frame, it could create a distracting, wrong look that breaks the match in editing. The source advises that a neutral look, where the subject looks straight into the lens, should only be used in emergencies, like when retakes aren't possible or you're trying to match unknown stock footage. If you're in doubt on set, it's always best to film a scene with players looking both left and right to give the editor options.
Can players or the camera move across the axis during a shot?
Yes, a player can turn their head or body, or the camera can dolly across the axis within a continuous shot without breaking continuity.
Ah, okay.
But if a shot ends with a player looking in a new direction relative to the previous shots, that new look effectively establishes a new axis for the shots that follow.
So it's a new line.
For a sequence centered on a single person in a static position, the source recommends staying with the original axis for simplicity and clarity.
How do you manage continuity with multiple players or groups, like a speaker and an audience? That sounds complicated.
The source describes a couple of primary methods. One is the centerline axis running from the speaker directly to the audience, essentially treating it like a two-player opposing close-up setup. Camera positions are near the axis or in the corners. The speaker looks towards the audience, either left or right relative to the camera, and the audience looks towards the speaker in the opposing direction.
So they look at each other across the cuts.
For the smoothest cutting, yes, consecutive shots of the speaker and audience should oppose each other in screen direction. This method works well for simple sequences like a classroom.
And the parallel axis.
This is where the action axis runs parallel to the rows of the audience. The speaker can sweep their look left and right across the audience. The audience members on one side of the center look right, and those on the other side look left.
Okay.
Again, you intercut speaker and audience shots with opposing looks for the best effect. This method offers more freedom and visual variety in terms of camera positions and movement.
You can even combine these methods in a longer sequence.
For lengthy sequences, yes. Combining centerline and parallel axis treatments can add visual variety. For stage action where the performers on stage are only relating to each other and not the audience, managing continuity is less complex as you don't need opposing looks between stage and audience.
It's clear that managing time and space continuity is largely about creating a convincing illusion for the viewer.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Motion pictures, despite their appearance of reality, are an illusion.
Right.
While you can use real by-the-clock time, techniques like cut-in and cut-away shots allow you to compress or expand time or action without the audience even noticing. There aren't fixed, absolute rules for depicting time and space, because the goal is the impression of continuity, not necessarily literal reality.
But that illusion must be believable.
Crucially, the audience must receive the impression that they are viewing the events in their entirety, even in compilation films made of disparate footage. If that illusion is broken, the spell is gone, and the audience becomes aware of the filmmaking itself, which is usually distracting.
So, to bridge gaps in time or space smoothly when needed, you use transitional devices.
Yes, these are techniques used to signal a time lapse or a change of location to the audience in a clear way, bridging the discontinuity. The source categorizes them into pictorial and sound transitions.
Let's look at the visual ones first.
Simplest is introductory titles, title cards or supers explaining the upcoming time or location.
Basic but effective.
Then you have dissolves, where one image gradually fades out while the next image fades in over it. This is a classic technique used to cover time lapses, location changes, soften abrupt scene changes, transition between titles, or even discreetly cover a jump cut.
Okay.
The length of the dissolve can vary with the dramatic tempo. The source gives examples like dissolving through highlights of a repetitive industrial process, or dissolving from a shot of a character leaving an office to a shot of them leaving the building, implying the passage of time and intervening actions. Fade-ins, where the image appears from a black screen, are typically used to begin a story or a sequence. Fade-outs, where the image disappears to black, and a story or sequence.
Like punctuation.
Exactly. They are often used in pairs, a fade-out followed by a fade-in, to clearly segregate narrative units, much like chapters in a book or acts in a play. Used between sequences in the same location, a fade-out, fade-in indicates the passage of a significant period of time, days, weeks, months. They can also signal a switch to another setting. The source advises using fade sparingly to avoid making the film feel choppy or overly episodic.
Wipes are more forceful.
Yes, wipes are more abrupt.
Right.
A new image appears and seems to physically push the old image off the screen,
Yeah.
often with a specific pattern, like a straight line, a circle, etc.
Right.
They cover changes in time, space, or location quite abruptly, like the elevator example, where a wipe might show a character entering the elevator and then wipe to show them exiting on a different floor or at a later time.
And superimpositions.
Laying two or more images on top of each other simultaneously. This can be used to show events happening at the same time in different places, or to represent a character's thoughts, memories, or dreams.
Montages seem particularly useful for conveying a lot of information or time quickly.
They're incredibly powerful for that. A montage is a series of short, rapidly edited shots used to convey the passage of significant time, show a flurry of activity, or express abstract ideas.
Like a training montage.
Exactly. They often incorporate stock shots. The tempo is key and can even be coordinated with a metronome for rhythm. The movement within the shots, subject or camera, can be similar or contrasting for effect.
Okay.
Montages are frequently used for introductions, transitions between locations, or summarizing a period of activity or development. The source provides detailed examples of travel montages showing rapid cuts of car wheels, maps, passports, hotel labels, road signs, changing terrain, tickets, and various modes of transport.
Gets the idea across fast.
They can also use well-known symbols, like cutting to pyramids or the Acropolis, to quickly introduce a country or city without needing titles.
And cutaway close-ups can function as a pictorial transition, too. How?
Yes, specifically as a distracting element. A cutaway close-up can be used to draw the audience's eye away from the main action momentarily, allowing the editor to make a directional change, cover a time lapse, or even hide a jump cut in the main sequence. When used purely for this purpose, the source notes that the cutaway doesn't even need to match the main action or have a specific look. Its job is simply to distract the viewer's attention at the precise moment of the cut.
Sneaky. Beyond visuals, sound can also bridge time and space effectively.
Absolutely. Sound can transition time and space, often with more flexibility than visuals alone, because it's less geographically tied.
Like narration.
Monologue or narration is a prime example, especially in compilation films like newsreels. Continuous narration can provide the connective tissue between disparate visual shots that might otherwise lack context or visual connection, propelling the story forward.
Like a countdown sound cutting between a control room and tracking stations.
Exactly. That's a sound cue, instantly bridging different locations and actions. Telephone conversations are another simple way to switch locales visually.
Right, cutting back and forth.
You cut between the person speaking on one end and the person listening or responding on the other. Radio or TV broadcasts can show the source of the broadcast and then cut to audience reactions in different places. Cutting between different locations, showing people reacting to the same news event, is a common use.
Music can immediately establish location or theme.
Definitely. Familiar songs, national anthems, regional folk songs, or even specific city themes can instantly tell the audience where they are or set a particular mood or theme, simplifying identification without needing titles or inserts.
Yeah.
The source gives examples like using a national air to indicate a country or a tune like Meet Me in St. Louis for that specific city.
Sound effects, too.
Yes. Sound effects can effectively bridge movement or add impact across a cut. The source provides an example, showing an engineer pound their fist on a desk, followed by the sound of an explosion, cutting to the result. The sound effect bridges the cause and effect across the visual cut.
And there's a crucial point about sound flow, particularly in synced sound films, where the audio is tied to the picture.
Yes, this is really important for the editor.
What's important about sound flow?
It's critical for smooth editing. Sound, especially dialogue, should ideally flow across scene cuts, rather than having both the picture and the sound start and stop precisely together at each splice.
Why is that better?
Editors prefer to continue dialogue or ambient sound over reaction shots or other cutaway shots. This creates a much smoother back-and-forth feel and avoids abrupt, choppy editing.
Less jarring.
The source gives a direct instruction to the cameraman here. Never stop the camera in the middle of important dialogue, even if you think the visual isn't needed, because the editor might need that sound segment to play over a different shot.
Keep rolling for the sound.
In sync sound, camera cuts are often ideally predetermined or at least heavily influenced by the content of the soundtrack.
So all these techniques, both visual and sound, are tools to create and maintain that essential illusion of continuous reality, guiding the audience even when time or space is being manipulated.
Precisely. And the power of these techniques comes from understanding how they work together to serve the narrative.
Right.
The source reminds us repeatedly that technically perfect shots or seamless transitions mean little if the underlying story is illogical, uninteresting, or incoherent.
Story first.
The audience should never have to actively struggle to follow what's happening unless that confusion is a deliberate narrative choice for suspense. For a cameraman shooting off the cuff, understanding these story values, audience reaction, and editorial needs is absolutely vital to ensure their footage can actually be cut into a meaningful story later.
Makes sense.
The film must capture and hold interest, building as it progresses. Each shot makes a point, and the linked scenes create a combined effect that is greater than the sum of its parts.
That smooth linking of shots brings us to the third C, cutting. This is where the physical act of joining the film strips happens, but it's much more than just splicing.
It's the decisive act in assembly. Cutting is the joining of film strips, but its role is fundamental in establishing the tempo of the film, maintaining that crucial continuity we just discussed, and clarifying the storytelling by juxtaposition.
We touched on compilation cutting earlier, where visuals are linked primarily by narration.
Yes, this is common in newsreels, documentaries, or industrial films, where the primary narrative thread is carried by a voiceover. The visuals serve mainly to illustrate the audio track.
Doesn't have to match perfectly.
In this method, meticulous matching between consecutive shots isn't strictly necessary. You can incorporate disparate footage because the narration holds it together logically. This offers great flexibility, and you can actually break many traditional editing rules as long as the narration provides coherence.
Okay.
However, even within a compilation sequence, you might use continuity cutting for specific mini-stories or actions that need to feel realistic.
Continuity cutting or match cutting is the opposite. Everything has to line up perfectly.
It is the standard for realistic, flowing action in theatrical films. Continuity cutting aims for smooth, continuous action across the splice. This requires meticulous matching between consecutive shots.
All those details.
Players' positions, their action, direction of movement, speed, looks, eyeline, clothing, props, and key background elements must all align precisely. This is essential for the audience to believe they are watching one continuous event unfold.
And cutting on action.
That's a key technique within continuity cutting. It's making the splice during a movement so that the action starts in one shot and finishes seamlessly in the next.
Makes it invisible.
If done well, the audience doesn't even notice the cut. It's difficult, especially with fast action, to get the timing perfect. The source advises cameramen to film action to completion and overlap the action at the beginning of the next shot.
Give the editor options.
This provides the editor with crucial flexibility to find the absolute perfect frame to make the cut on action. The source strongly cautions against cutting on action in the camera, where the cameraman stops filming precisely mid-movement. This severely handicaps the editor and makes achieving a smooth match cut very difficult.
Match cutting sounds like it puts a lot of pressure on continuity on set.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Careful note-taking on set is essential details about costume, props, blocking, and player positioning. This is particularly challenging when filming matching scenes later or on a different location.
Easy to mess up.
Matching problems with eye lines, screen, direction of travel, or even subtle changes in clothing or props can easily arise. The source offers practical advice. If you're ever in doubt about whether a shot will match, film the scene or action both ways, exploring different angles or positions.
Cover yourself.
It might take a little more time and film on the day, but reshooting later due to a continuity error is far more costly.
And cutting is the tool used to fix or avoid those jarring jump cuts we discussed.
Exactly. Jump cuts, where the subject appears to suddenly jerk or shift slightly, are disorienting and break the flow.
Yeah.
They typically happen when the camera angle changes only slightly between two shots, while the image size of the subject remains the same or very similar. The solution, applied in the edit, relies on the cameraman having provided suitable footage. Ensure you change both the image size and the camera angle significantly between shots that you intend to cut together.
Change both.
By presenting a distinctly different viewpoint, the audience's brain processes it as a new perspective, covering any minor mismatches that would otherwise result in a jump. Shifting the viewpoint by moving around the subject rather than just straight in or out is key here.
What about intercutting moving shots with static shots? The source suggests this can be tricky.
It is, except under specific circumstances. A series of moving shots can intercut smoothly if the tempo and direction of the camera movement are maintained. However, intercutting a shot with a moving camera with a static shot of the same subject isn't straightforward and can often feel jarring unless the moving shot ends in a static pose that can be matched, or it's used as a transition to a static shot.
There's an interesting point here, debunking a common myth about moving shots adding speed.
Yes, the source challenges the idea that moving shots inherently add flow or speed up the screen action. Often the opposite is true.
Really?
Moving shots can actually slow the story down because they contain useless footage moments where the camera is just moving from point A to point B without capturing significant action or revealing new information en route.
Takes time to move.
The camera movement itself takes time. While dramatically motivated movement is powerful, several straight-cut static shots that get directly to the point are often more efficient and create a faster pace than one long, drawn-out camera move, according to the source.
Interesting.
A moving shot can be hard to insert cleanly between static shots unless the camera comes to a distinct stop. Straight cuts are generally faster because they jump directly to the point of interest.
How do protection shots relate to cutting? What are those?
Protection shots are extra takes, variations, or different angles filmed specifically to give the editor more options and flexibility, because the editor's precise needs often aren't fully known or anticipated during filming.
Like filming a pan at different speeds.
Exactly. If the editor needs a fast pan or a slow pan, the cameraman provides options. Other examples include filming pans or tilts of static scenes in both left to right and right to left directions.
Okay.
For lengthy moving shots, you might film static shots at the beginning and end points of the move in case the editor needs to cut the movement short. For a Dutch angle effect, you might film the shot tilted both left and right to see which works best, or if opposing tilts are needed.
And reaction close-ups as protection.
These are incredibly useful, especially for lengthy scenes filmed primarily from one wider angle, like documenting an industrial operation.
How do they protect?
By inserting reaction shots of an observer, the editor can remove unnecessary footage from the main shot, perhaps a repetitive task, without creating a jump cut.
Ah, bridges the gap.
The source even suggests filming all-purpose reaction close-ups against a neutral background, with the subject looking in various directions, left, right, up, down. These are highly flexible and can be inserted almost anywhere the editor needs to cover a cut or remove footage.
We talked about sound flow in the context of continuity, but how does sound editing specifically tie into cutting?
In sync sound films, where the dialogue or primary audio is synchronized with the picture, the visual cutting is heavily constrained by the soundtrack.
The sound dictates the cut.
The editor essentially has to cut to the sound. They must use whatever visual footage corresponds to the segment of audio they need. This significantly limits their freedom to juggle visual images compared to editing a narrated film where the visuals are more illustrative and less tied to specific timing.
And that preference for sound flowing across cuts applies here too.
Yes, absolutely. Editors strongly prefer sound, especially dialogue, to flow across the visual cuts, continuing overreaction shots or other cutaways, rather than having both picture and sound start and stop abruptly together in each shot.
Smoother feel.
This creates that smooth, natural, back-and-forth conversational feel. And this circles back to the cameraman's responsibility. Never stop the camera in the middle of important dialogue if the sound is needed, even if you think the picture at that moment won't be used.
Right, sound might be needed elsewhere.
The editor might need that specific audio segment to play over a completely different shot. Camera cuts in sync sound should ideally be predetermined or guided by the content of the soundtrack.
So cutting is the final assembly, but its success is really determined by the careful planning and shooting choices made based on angles and continuity beforehand.
Exactly. It's where all the prior decisions come together. And that brings us to the fourth C, a technique of immense power for focus and emotion.
Close-ups.
Yes. The source highlights their purpose and power. Close-ups magnify small-scale action, they clarify what's happening by showing crucial detail, and perhaps most importantly, they heighten viewer interest and involvement by bringing them closer to the subject.
Getting intimate.
Whether it's a person's face or a key object. They're incredibly powerful tools to isolate, emphasize, introduce subjects that can even start a sequence effectively, show intricate detail, and convey subtle emotion.
The source differentiates between cut-in and cut-away close-ups. What's the key difference?
This is a critical distinction for clarity. A cut-in close-up is a portion of the main action or scene you are already watching. It's a detail within that established space.
Part of the main scene.
The source emphasizes it must be established in a preceding wider shot, a long shot, or medium shot. The audience needs to see the wider context first to know where that close-up detail is located within the scene and recognize the subject or action when they cut closer.
Orientation.
This is vital for audience orientation, especially with multiple players or complex devices. Like the example of a mechanic working on a jet engine. You show the engine in a medium shot, then cut into the mechanic's hands on a specific part.
You know where the hands are.
You understand where those hands are relative to the whole engine. If significant player or camera movement occurs after a cut-in, a reestablishing wider shot might be needed to prevent confusion. The significance of the close-up should be immediately comprehensible.
So a cut-in is contextually part of the main shot. A cutaway close-up is something different.
Yes, a cutaway close-up is detached from the main action. It's not necessarily part of the scene you were just watching in the wider shot.
Okay.
Cutaways are used for commentary, to show reaction, or specifically for distraction. The source notes that cutaways do not need to be matched to the main action or established in a preceding shot if they are showing players or objects that weren't in the previous shot.
Like a reaction shot of someone else.
Like cutting to a man-in-the-street reaction shot after a courtroom verdict. And importantly, when used deliberately to distract the audience to cover a directional change, time-lapse, or jump cut, the cutaway absolutely does not need to match the main action or have a specific eyeline or look.
The distraction technique again.
Its sole purpose in that instance is to draw the viewer's eye away momentarily.
The source talks about angles for cutaway close-ups, too.
You can film cutaways with an objective camera angle, which provides an impersonal viewpoint while still bringing the viewer closer. Or you can film them with a subjective angle, where the person looks directly into the camera lens.
Looking at you.
This direct-address subjective approach is less common in theatrical films, but incredibly powerful in newsreels or documentaries. The source calls it a stronger technique for direct address than a standard interview format.
Like an engineer explaining something.
The example of an engineer explaining something with charts while looking directly at the camera makes the viewer feel personally addressed. An unseen, off-screen speaker can even provide questions.
Close-ups can even substitute for action you can't actually film.
This is a brilliant application of close-ups. They can stand in for action that is hidden, inaccessible, too dangerous, or even too expensive or gruesome to show directly. Think about action happening inside complex machines, blast furnaces, or electronic computers. The source describes showing a series of close-ups of the control panel, the operator's hands on switches, dials, and gauges, to imply the complex action happening inside the machine that the camera can't see.
Suggests the action.
Seconds of exterior close-ups can cover minutes of invisible operation. This is also useful for action too gruesome or expensive to depict fully, like war, accidents, or disasters.
Right.
Instead of showing the full event, you show the horrified reaction of a bystander in a close-up, or simulate the action with rapid, disorienting close-ups. The source uses the example of a car crash shown through quick, shaky shots of the driver's face, a POV through the windshield, glass breaking, hands on the wheel.
Implies it powerfully. When you have a series of consecutive close-ups, how do you make them work together?
For a series of close-ups that cut back and forth, like opposing players in a dialogue scene, uniformity in image size and angle is generally preferred for smooth flow.
Keep them consistent.
Back and forth close-ups should be matched in size and angle, whether they're objective or POV. While variations are possible, the source advises presenting a matched pair before switching size or angle to avoid a disjointed hodgepodge effect.
Got it.
Maintaining this uniformity requires careful planning on set, good shooting notes, and sometimes filming both ways if there's uncertainty about what will cut best.
Player movement into or out of close-ups, does that require overlapping action like with wider shots?
Yes. Movement should flow smoothly across the cut between a wider shot and a close-up, requiring that crucial overlapping action we discussed in cutting.
Okay.
The source even mentions a specific technique for filming tight static head close-ups of a standing player. They keep their feet static, bend their upper body to the side, and then swing back to vertical to precisely frame their head in the tight shot.
Clever trick. This point about close-up tempo and magnified movements appearing accelerated is really counterintuitive.
It is, but it's a crucial detail, particularly with non-actors or in non-theatrical films. The timing of player movements within a close-up is critical and must match the tempo of the shots before and after it.
Why?
Especially if the movement flows across a cut, cutting on action. Because small movements are magnified in a close-up, they appear much faster, almost accelerated on screen than they did in reality.
Let's sped up.
The source gives the example of a pilot's relatively fast arm movement in a medium shot versus the much slower, deliberate finger movement needed to calibrate a knob in a close-up.
So small actions and large close-ups need to be done deliberately slowly.
Absolutely. The source stresses this point. Routine tasks performed by industrial or research personnel, for instance, might need specific coaching to be done much slower than usual when filmed in a close-up.
To look normal speed on screen?
Exactly. If the tempo varies greatly between wider shots and close-ups, it prevents smooth cutting on action and forces the editor to make static cuts after the movement has finished.
And the backgrounds in close-ups are super important.
They are vital because they're often slightly out of focus and shouldn't pull attention away from the magnified subject. Avoid busy or distracting backgrounds, highly detailed designs, shiny surfaces, or anything moving.
Keep it simple back there.
Unless the subject matter itself justifies it, like filming in an amusement park or a dynamic TV commercial. In dramatic films, distracting backgrounds compete for the viewer's attention and undermine the focus on the subject.
Right.
Bright or colored lights and reflections in the background are particularly distracting. Favor nondescript, softly contrasting pastel or neutral hues.
And watch out for things sticking out of heads.
Plan your angles carefully to avoid objects appearing awkwardly behind the subject's head or shoulders. Lamps, picture frames, trees, poles, furniture parts can look like they're growing out of someone's head.
Yeah, that looks bad.
The source suggests repositioning the offending object, moving the player slightly, or even temporarily removing a small part of an object if only a tiny bit shows. But remember to put it back for wider shots. Player or camera movement in wider shots can also be used to position players favorably against better backgrounds for subsequent close-ups.
To wrap up close-ups, they're a tool for emphasis, not just getting closer.
Exactly. They are powerful, expressive tools that must make a deliberate point. They need a strong narrative motive, emphasis on detail, revealing character or emotion, eliminating repetitive action shown in wider shots, substituting for hidden or unfilmable action, adding dramatic intensity, or providing distraction.
Purposeful again.
A close-up is most effective when it serves a clear purpose in the storytelling.
All these C's build upon each other, and composition feels like the final layer, how you arrange everything visually within that framed space.
That's a great way to put it. Good composition is the art and science of arranging all the pictorial elements within the frame, the players, the setting, the props,
Everything you see.
to form a unified, harmonious, and meaningful whole. It's how the cameraman positions everything. The primary goal is to create favorable visual reactions from the audience and, crucially, to concentrate their attention on the single most significant element in the picture at that moment, whether it's a player, an object, or an action.
It's more than just making the shot look pretty.
Much, much more.
Yeah.
The source is clear that composition isn't just about applying static rules to create aesthetically pleasing but empty images. It must have character, meaning, and ideally, movement.
Got it.
Thoughtful composition is what elevates raw footage into good motion picture scenes. While movement itself can grab attention even with poor composition, if movement is used haphazardly, it becomes liability. Compositional rules are most directly applicable to static action, establishing shots or moments where the action pauses.
Okay.
But striving for aesthetic values and considered arrangement is important in every shot, even as subjects or the camera are moving. You need continuous composing as things shift.
There are some basic compositional rules, and I know you can break them, but they're starting points, like avoiding the subject dead center.
Yes, the source lists these fundamental guidelines. Avoid placing the main subject directly in the middle of the frame. It often feels static and uninteresting.
Rule of thirds territory.
Sort of related, yeah.
Yeah.
Avoid dividing the frame into two equal halves, for instance, with a perfectly centered horizon line or a diagonal mountainside that splits the screen down the middle. Avoid strictly straight lines running parallel to the frame sides unless they're part of a deliberate pattern, like a row of columns. Single strong lines should ideally be irregular or angled.
Okay.
You should also be aware of silhouetted lines, like a doorway frame, that could unintentionally look like a technical fault on screen.
And the source delves into how different types of lines within the frame can subconsciously influence how we feel or interpret what we're seeing.
This is where visual psychology comes in. Different lines evoke different feelings. Straight lines tend to suggest masculinity or strength. Softly curved lines suggest femininity or delicate qualities.
Interesting.
Sharply curved lines imply action or gaiety. Long vertical curves with tapering ends can suggest dignified beauty or melancholy. Long horizontal lines suggest quietness, restfulness, stability, but paradoxically also speed, as a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Parallel diagonals that converge suggest action, energy, and tension, reinforced by things like light glinting on train tracks. Diagonal lines are generally the most dramatic and strongest,
Diagonals are dynamic.
suggesting opposing forces, stresses, power, or overcoming obstacles, like in battle scenes. This dynamic tension can even be suggested in static shots using a Dutch tilt. A diagonal slanting up from lower left to upper right suggests ascent or effort, while one slanting from upper left to lower right suggests descent or weight.
Up and down feel.
Zigzag diagonals suggest swiftness or menace, like lightning. Cross diagonals imply opposing forces, like crossed swords.
So the composition isn't just about what you see, but the emotional weight and narrative implied by the arrangement of shapes and lines.
Exactly. And how subjects move within the frame left to right, up, down, or diagonally also impacts interpretation, often reinforced by depicting gravity naturally.
How so?
Horizontal movement suggests travel or momentum. Left to right is often easier and feels more natural for viewers conditioned by reading left to right. Right to left is felt as stronger, more like moving against the grain, often used for dramatic opposition, like a hero moving towards a villain's stronghold.
Vertical movement has strong associations, too.
Definitely. Ascending vertical movement suggests aspiration, exaltation, growth, freedom from weight, or uplifting feelings. Think smoke rising, a missile launch, religious figures, or anything that feels lighter.
Going up feels positive.
Descending vertical movement suggests heaviness, danger, crushing power, or portrays doom, a pile driver dropping, an avalanche, a waterfall, something coming down upon you.
Coming down feels heavy or threatening.
Diagonal movement is the most dramatic.
Yeah.
Ascent diagonally is typically lower left to upper right, like someone climbing a mountain. Descent is upper left to lower right, like something being lowered. The source mentions angling a model supersonic transport upward on screen to create the visual impression of actual flight. Depicting gravity naturally reinforces these directions. A balloon goes up, LLUR. An object falls down, ULLR. Water flows downhill, ULLR. Person climbs uphill, LLUR.
What about deliberately defying gravity or using tilted angles compositionally?
That's unbalanced composition. Creating images that feel baseless or using tilted Dutch angles deliberately result in slanted, off-balance images. This is used when the script specifically calls for showing violence, fear, panic, or creating a disorienting, impressionistic effect.
The source also gives a specific rule about horizon placement.
Yes, a key one. The horizon should never be placed exactly in the middle of the frame because it visually divides the picture into two equal, often static halves.
Don't split it 50-50.
Generally, the sky should occupy either roughly 1/3 or 2/3 of the frame. The horizon can also be completely out of frame in low or high-angle shots, or appear as a very thin line at the very bottom if the sky, like a dramatic sunset, is the main focus.
Beyond the arrangement of physical elements, visual factors like lighting, tonal value, lightness or darkness, and colors are powerful compositional tools because they direct the viewer's eye.
How do they do that?
The viewer's eye is instinctively drawn to the most brightly illuminated area, the lightest toned area, or the most colorful area in the picture. Contrast attracts attention.
So you can use that to make the lead player the most important thing to look at.
Exactly. You can make the lead player the primary center of interest by giving them lighter or more colorful clothing, or by illuminating them more brightly than other elements.
Makes them pop.
Even a small, bright object will often advance from a dark background and draw attention. The source cautions against unintentionally letting subordinate players or objects steal the scene just because they happen to catch the light or have a visually dominant color.
This concept of eye scan and continuity of attention is really insightful how the viewer's eyes actually move across the screen.
It's crucial for smooth storytelling. In still photography, you position the center of interest where you want the eye to go. In motion pictures, the eye scan needs to transition smoothly between consecutive shots.
Okay.
If the main center of interest, or where a character is looking, is in a specific part of the frame in one shot, it should ideally be in approximately the same portion of the frame, or clearly directed towards the proper portion in the next shot.
Otherwise, the viewer has to search for it.
Yes, their eye has to jump around the frame to find the new point of interest, and that effort breaks narrative continuity and can feel jarring. The source suggests marking the film to check this.
But sometimes you want that abrupt eye jump.
For dramatic effect, yes. A sudden burst of activity, a surprising movement, or a new development can be emphasized by deliberately causing the viewer's eye to shift abruptly to a new area of the frame. This is often most effective when it happens during a lull in the action, catching the audience off guard.
And the dominant position in the frame, where should the important stuff be?
Generally, the most important player, object, or action is positioned on the right side of the frame. This is based on visual weighting.
Right side is stronger.
They can be on the left, but usually that left-positioned player is given preferential treatment through lighting, angling, or contrast to establish their importance. In symmetrical two-shots, dominance often shifts back and forth with the dialogue.
Okay.
Introducing a new, potentially threatening element, like a villain or a surprising prop from the left side of the frame during a lull in the action, can create surprise or shock because it enters from the less dominant, unexpected side.
It's clear that composition needs to be integrated with the other C's, especially camera angles.
Absolutely. You can't compose for one angle in isolation if the sequence will show the scene from multiple viewpoints. Composition and camera angles must be integrated so that elements are well composed as the camera moves or as you cut between different angles.
A good composition in a long shot might work for closer shots if the angles don't change drastically.
Yes, that's often the case. However, player and camera movement within the scene are key. They can be assets if carefully planned, but they can also be liabilities if the static composition deteriorates due to random movement.
Keep it composed even when moving.
The goal is continuous composition, where players and camera move in harmony to maintain pleasing arrangements, keep players properly framed, ensure key positions are well composed, and maintain a good relationship between players and their backgrounds. You achieve this by first composing the key static positions in the scene, and then working out the movement of players and the camera door to transition smoothly and compositionally between those points.
The source lists many specific techniques to enhance composition.
Some we've touched on in other sections, but they are also compositional tools. Providing leads, giving space in the direction a subject is moving or looking feels natural.
Room to move.
Framing the subject using foreground objects like tree branches, doorways, or arches adds depth and focuses attention. Using layers by positioning elements on multiple planes, foreground, middle ground, background, creates a sense of depth.
Right.
Perspective, particularly atmospheric or aerial perspective in outdoor scenes where distant objects appear lighter and softer, enhances depth. Overlapping players or objects is a simple but effective way to show spatial relationships, clearly indicating which is nearer, especially with unfamiliar objects whose size is hard to judge.
Backgrounds again. Important for composition too.
Critically, don't ignore them. Good composition integrates backgrounds to add activity, authenticity, and realism relevant to the scene, showing the machines in a factory, the crops on a farm, the activity at an airport.
Context.
Choose angles and stage actions so that players move against relevant backgrounds that enhance the storytelling, rather than just a blank wall.
Depth of field plays a role.
Yes, choosing your lens impacts what is in focus. A wide-angle lens provides greater depth of field, keeping objects relatively sharp from near to far, which can be useful for compositional layers. A telephoto lens creates shallow depth of field, isolating the subject against a blurred background.
And using specific patterns or shapes?
Yes, you can use diagonal or circular lines in composition for dynamic or unifying effects, like filming pairs of display objects in opposing diagonal patterns. A simple circular composition, like the SAC B52 example the source gives, can reinforce ideas of unity or purpose. High angles showing machines forming diagonal lines can suggest action or purposefulness. The source also mentions the classic pyramid composition, often used for comfort or support, where a dominant character consoling a distressed player is composed with the distressed player's head resting on the dominant character's shoulder, forming a pyramid shape.
Finally, what compositional pitfalls should be avoided?
Avoid static, flat-on compositions. Avoid centering your subject or putting the horizon dead in the middle. Avoid strict, straight lines parallel to the frame unless they're part of a deliberate pattern.
The basic.
Avoid using the same size images or angles repeatedly in a series. It becomes visually tedious. Avoid player or camera movement that accidentally obscures faces or important action. Avoid distracting backgrounds. And finally, avoid slipping into routine or lazy composition just because of schedule pressure or budget constraints.
Fight the routine.
The source encourages striving for a slightly different treatment whenever possible to maintain visual interest. So what does all this add up to? We've unpacked the 5 C's as laid out by Joseph Mascelli: camera angles, continuity, cutting, close-ups, and composition.
Camera angles defining our viewpoint and perspective on the action. Continuity ensuring a smooth, logical flow in time and space, creating the believable illusion of reality.
Right. Cutting, linking the shots together, establishing tempo, and clarifying the narrative. Close-ups providing crucial emphasis, showing vital detail and magnifying emotion.
and composition, arranging all the visual elements within the frame to create harmony, convey meaning, and guide the viewer's eye. What becomes clear is that these aren't just isolated technical rules. They are the fundamental building blocks of a visual grammar.
The language of film.
Mastery in filmmaking, that elusive cinematic art, comes from integrating these principles seamlessly. It's how filmmakers elevate raw footage into powerful, clear, and emotionally resonant storytelling. They tap into how we subconsciously process visual information, guiding our attention, shaping our understanding, and influencing our feelings through these deliberate, often invisible choices.
That's the real takeaway, isn't it? It's not just about capturing an image, it's about the planning and the clear purpose behind each choice related to these 5 C's. Understanding them is absolutely key to seeing the difference between filming that simply records and filmmaking that tells a story with visual mastery.
It raises an important question for you, the listener. Now that you've had this deep dive into the 5 C's, how will you look at movies, TV shows, and even videos differently?
Yeah. Will you start noticing the camera angles more? Asking yourself why the camera was put there for that shot? Will you see how scenes are cut together, how close-ups are used to make you focus on something specific or feel a certain way, or how everything is arranged within the frame?
Consider why a filmmaker might have chosen a high angle in one moment and a low angle in the next, or used a quick montage versus a long dissolve, or placed a character off-center. Think about how those deliberate choices, rooted in the 5 C's, affect your own viewing experience and emotional response.
The true power lies in recognizing that every decision the filmmaker makes using these principles is designed to influence how you see the story and how you feel about it. It's the hidden language that speaks directly to your eyes and your emotions.
And that understanding is your shortcut to appreciating the enduring craft of cinematography.